This time, I would like to introduce our first presenter. In the world of eyesight, having 20/20 vision is considered normal or clear vision. It has been said that hindsight is 20/20, meaning we can see things more clearly when we are looking back. Looking back, though, can sometimes keep us from seeing the amazing path ahead. Tonia Latham will be walking with us on a journey this evening that requires 20/20 vision for more than just the Toastmasters parts of our lives. What you could say qualifies Tonia to do such a thing? Well, she's the Strategic Development Director with Epic 9 Marketing in Maryville, Tennessee. She's a member of the Morning Cup Toastmasters for 4 years. She's a current District 63 reigning champion for the evaluation speech contest and the former VPPR for her club. Tonia also leads multiple marketing workshops throughout Tennessee, Georgia, Virginia, South Carolina, and Kentucky. Has been a guest speaker at UT Halston College of Business and has been a guest lecturer in a nonprofit studies and advocacy at Marysville College and Carson Newman University. Additionally, Tonia leads visionary classes for individuals and groups and businesses, helping people define and design their visions for the future. Tonia's passion is to help her friends, which we are, her clients and community, reach the top of their mountain. Let us welcome Tonia Latham.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this afternoon. Thank you, Bert, for that wonderful welcome. And thank you, Toastmaster friends. And Bert was right. You are my friends. I love that I get to say that about my Toastmasters friends, no matter where we are and no matter when we meet. And that's what's valuable about what we do as Toastmasters. Now, the title of what I want to talk about today is Welcome Froward. One thing I started hearing a lot after that wonderful time that was 2020 was, will we ever get back to normal? We're going to talk a little bit about that today and what that really means. Before we get there, though, there's a couple of things I want to ask of you. Please get a piece of paper. You're going to need it. And you're going to need a pen, pencil, something. Ever how you're going to do something toward the end of what we're going to talk about today. Everybody got that? Wonderful. Here's my question to start with. You don't need to write anything down yet. I'll tell you when that time comes. I want you to think back for a minute. And where were you on September 11th, 2001? You can raise your hand. And I'm going to ask you individually, because once you raise your hand and I recognize you, I'm going to unmute you so that, or you can unmute so that we can answer. Who remembers where you were September the 11th, 2001? Denise, where were you? You can unmute yourself, Denise.
Okay, thank you. I was getting ready for work and I was walking between the bathroom and the bedroom. And I looked up at the TV and I saw all this smoke. And I said, what show is this, I wonder? And I stood there very close to the TV. And then I saw what was happening. Mm-hmm. And I looked outside and I looked back at the TV and I thought, how is this happening? I just don't understand it. Mm-hmm. But I remember exactly where I was and what I was doing. And that actually, I was glad I wasn't in the car going to work yet. Mm-hmm. But yes, to answer your question, Tonia, that's where I was.
Thank you, Denise. Justin, where were you?
Yes, I was a senior in high school and I was working as an office assistant when I saw the video of the first plane aftermath, and I was watching as the second plane went into the second tower.
Thank you, Dustin. Where were you?
I was in my dormitory at Western Kentucky University, getting ready for my psychology class. That's exactly where I was.
Mhm. Susan, where were you?
I was at work already that morning, and I was walking by a conference room, and I saw it on TV. Someone had noticed it on their had an alert, and I saw it on TV. So it was interesting. We just stopped what we were doing, and
Mhm. Yep. One more. Mark, where were you?
I was still living in California. And so I didn't hear about the incident until I had awakened and it was a Pacific time zone a couple of hours later. I was worried to death because my family's from New York City.
Mhm.
I went to my computer and saw the photos. I saw this big plume trailing over the western end of Brooklyn, New York.
Mhm.
I tried calling my family and all I got was static. And then I really started getting,
Mhm.
I'll remember that years ago though.
And that's it. We still do remember. The majority of us remember where we were on 9/11 because that was one of those life-changing moments. It almost becomes a mile marker in wherever we are and in whatever we're doing. I remember that day just as clearly as you all do. I was actually on staff at a network of churches, and we were moving into a new building that day. We didn't have any good internet connection. The phones weren't even hooked up well yet, way back in 2001. And I've never forgotten getting that phone call from a friend. And she said, "What are you doing right now?" And I said, "Well, I had to dig my cell phone out of my pocket." Way back then, cell phones were not something that we carried with us everywhere like we do now. And I told her, "We're moving. Why are you calling?" And she said, "You need to turn on the TV." I remember telling her, "We don't have one hooked up right now. What's happening?" And that's when she told me the first tower was already down and the second tower had just been hit. The crew that I was working with that time included one of our associate pastors, and he and I found a radio as quick as we could. And then in a few minutes, we got one of the TVs from the nursery and we got it all hooked up way back in the time of antennas. And we got our rabbit ears going so that we could get signal. And we sat there, and much like what you all were saying at the beginning, we watched the plumes of smoke go up. There wasn't anything we could do at that exact moment to change what was happening. And it was one of the weirdest feelings I have ever had in my life. Now, in the space of those next few hours, phone calls started coming in. People were worried. People were upset. My own family was worried. We didn't get contact with my cousin for 12 hours because he was in the Pentagon. And we can all probably tell these stories of what happened on 9/11 because it made an indelible mark on who we are as a people and who we are as individuals. I can also look back at that and I can see some great things that happened locally. People came together to help. There were people taking care of each other. There were people who were raising money for firefighters that they'd never met in New York City. There were remembrance services. There were all things happening around. And one of the most amazing second memories I have of that is driving to work 3 or 4 days later. I live very close to an airport, and I remember looking up in the skies. I'm driving that morning, and I saw an airplane. For quite a few days, we didn't see airplanes. They got grounded. And seeing that airplane was almost an assurance there for a second that things are a little bit different. Now, 9/11 is still something that I remember every year, like I know you all do too. And it's something that was horrible for our country. There's no way to make it any better. That associate pastor friend that I was with, every 9/11, one of us texts the other one, and all we say is, I remember. Whoever gets up first that morning, whether it's 5 o'clock or 9 o'clock or whatever it is, will send a text to the other one. And that's our way of memorializing that day, that memory, that moment. Now I'm going to ask you a different question. I'm going to ask you to do the same thing. Raise your hand. Who remembers the first time you heard about COVID or coronavirus? There are no hands raising yet. Oh, Elena.
The first time I heard about it was
Yes.
during a tornado cleanup in our neighborhood. And someone came by with a pack of masks to tell us about this pandemic that somehow had snuck up on us, at least in our neighborhood. And because there was a whole lot that wasn't known, I called one of my family members who runs data analysis for HCA hospitals to ask, like, what is the actual numbers? What's happening? We have a son who's high risk for a lot of health problems and diseases, and it was pretty impactful to be, especially being on the tail of the tornadoes in our neighborhood where there was a lot of damage and already a lot of upending for lives and things like that. That was the moment I learned about it.
Thank you, Elena. Trevor.
Yeah, I just remember, can you hear me okay?
I can.
I just remember hearing in the news from China, a few dozen people were sickened. And then a few days later, it was a few hundred and then a few thousand. And we know where it went from there. Yeah.
Yep. Thank you. Maureen.
Hey, we were doing something at work and it was a conference. It was a virtual conference. We had to make it virtual because of the pandemic, but we really didn't know what that meant. It was in March. I think it was around the 13th or something. And then we saw two people coming in from Florida and they had flown in and they had on masks and they were walking down the hallway of the office and we were going, why are they wearing masks? How strange they look. And we really didn't know what was going on. And then lo and behold, if we weren't all sent home, almost the next day and couldn't come back for a while.
Thank you. Is it Lethea or Lethea?
Yes, it's Lethea. And
Lethea?
yes, hello. And my experience is pretty much the same. We were at work and we were told to pack up. And I was like, what? And of course, we thought it was going to be 2 weeks, maybe a month. And, 18 months later, we were still pretty much working from home. So, yes, that was, and still, I'm in the office today, but we are kind of in a come when you want to come into the office mode. So it's been a whole new world.
Absolutely. Shanna?
Yes, so I had a friend on a group chat who was, and there were a few cases and we'd heard a little bit on news about it. And he told us he didn't know. They were worried they weren't getting to come back because they were starting that they were going to be stuck there. And so like by the time he did get back, we had been sent home from work too, but he was in like the last group of people that were allowed out of China back into the US. So it was pretty intense and it was pretty interesting.
Definitely. I remember the first time I heard about it. My friend Regina is the senior vice president for a large financial institution, and we were going to get together for coffee. And Regina messages me and she said, I can't meet this morning. I've got a meeting. I'm messaging back, oh, that's good, no worries. And then she picks up the phone to call me so we could reschedule. And she said, yeah, I've got to go to this pandemic response meeting. And the first words out of my mouth were, what pandemic? This was early January of 2020. Yes, I had heard some words and rumors before about an outbreak, but nobody had used the word pandemic yet, and nobody had used COVID-19 that I had heard yet. And that one conversation with Regina has stuck in my mind because that was a turning point for everything. Much like what some of you all have also said, my company went virtual in the next couple of months. I recently told our company's owner that I held a grudge against him for an extremely long time because the first message that we got about this was we're going to work from home for about 2 weeks. Well, we worked from home for a whole lot longer than 2 weeks. And I was not a happy camper. Some things happened over those next months, as we all know. There were a lot of cycles that happened in the United States. Yes, a lot of us ended up working from home remotely. Some of us were essential workers and ended up working twice as long or 3 times as long, or all sorts of things were happening. We couldn't see people at certain times. We held our distance at certain times. Some people got sick. Remember my pastor friend that I told you about earlier that we text each other every 9/11? In July of 2020, his brother died from complications from COVID. And I know for many of you all, you probably experienced some of the same things. You had friends or family who didn't make it through. And our whole worlds turned upside down. Now, when I think about what normal was before and what normal is now, those are 2 completely different definitions. There were things that we all had to do differently then in order to keep the same level of safety we would have experienced differently a few years ago and a few years before that. My mom went into radiation treatments in February of 2020. I didn't see her for 7 weeks because we weren't going to expose her to anything, that we didn't know what was really happening out there. And I know for many of you all, you went through those exact same things. So when I hear the phrase that a lot of people say, I just want to get back to normal, or welcome back. We heard that a lot when people started coming back into offices or different things like that. There are some things that happened in the last couple of years, friends, that I don't want to go back to. I am an extrovert. If you couldn't have figured that out already, if you've not met me in person yet, you'll know that in the first 30 seconds of meeting me, because I'll probably try to hug you. But since I can't hug you virtually, I'm going to tell you I am an extrovert. One of the very first things that I started to realize was happening is isolation is not good for me. I was okay the first day or two that we were going to work from home and work virtually. My company is a marketing company. We're very tech savvy. We can work from anywhere, and we have. I even had a home office well before that and was accustomed to it. But I was also accustomed to being able to get up, go meet the 3-dimensional people whenever I wanted to and needed to. Being told I couldn't and being in that stage of isolation started to do something to me. After about 2 or 3 days, I realized that I was not meant to be alone. After 4 or 5 days, my brother was checking on me twice a day to make sure that I was still holding on to my sanity. After about 10 days, I invented imaginary friends, and I gave them chores in my house to do. That's how much that I realized that I did not do well in isolation. And I think that we saw that in some of our Toastmasters groups too, when we weren't able to meet, when we weren't able to be together that isolation was starting to cause some things to happen. For some of our groups, that meant that people weren't able to move forward in their pathways or to move into their goals. For some of them, their socialization was occurring through Toastmasters. We have a few people in our group that work from home, that are virtual employees. They look at Toastmasters as their way to socialize every week, and they weren't able to get that anymore in the same way. It also took a lot of people during that isolation time. They had to decide, how are they going to be able to communicate? I started having Zoom meetings with my friends just because I needed to see faces. I don't know about you all, but that was important to me. And it was more than just having to talk to them on the phone. The second thing that I started to realize was happening back then that I don't want to go back to is that isolation led to loneliness. I live alone. There's nobody else that lives in my house. All 3 bedrooms are mine, everything. And then not visiting my family specifically during those first few weeks because of mom's illness really started to cause some loneliness. The isolation was more physical. The loneliness was far more emotional. And that's where I thought, I'm going to have to take control of some things here. And I'm going to have to put myself into some situations where I can overcome some of that loneliness. We saw that in our Toastmasters also, where we had to develop some new skills so that we weren't in that isolation and in that loneliness category. Going back to isolation for a minute, one thing that I love about my Toastmasters is we're no longer isolated into just our club, that you have to be physically present. We now have a member out of Uganda. We had attendees come out of South Africa and out of England because we all went virtual. We're still hybrid in our club. When I think about the loneliness aspect of that, I also joined an international mastermind group during that time, and we met virtually. I made friends from around the world, which helped with my loneliness because I wasn't able to get my in-person contact that I was accustomed to. The third thing that I do not want to go back to is I lost some of my vision during that time, physically and mentally. Physically, I lost physical 20/20 vision during that time. I had a cataract developed. I started to figure out some things were going wrong when I thought, eyes are just tired. I'm spending so much time staring at my computer all day long now on virtual or this and that and everything. No, it wasn't that. I actually had a cataract set in during that time. Now, we also weren't going to the doctor as quickly during that time, so it didn't get diagnosed as quickly because it wasn't an emergency. And I thought, I'm just tired. It crept up a little bit slower than I would have probably, I might have noticed it differently had we not been going through some of those things. I also lost some of my vision for the future. So not just physically, but my future focus. In 19, I had this massive goal laid out for my life. And if any of you all know me, I love lists. Lists are like the best thing ever. Whiteboards thrill me to death. I am in my office right now. If I could, I would turn my screen around and show you my whiteboard. But the owner of our company, when we moved in this building, he gave me my whiteboard. That's how important it is to me. But I love lists. I love my journals. I love the planning and then setting into motion the steps that are going to help us achieve those. With my own visionary company, I had set into some steps. I had had my first in-person visionary class. And then comes COVID. How am I going to implement all of this when we can't get in person anymore? And that was the model that I had built, was this had to be in person. How am I going to implement this and help other people achieve their goals if I'm not even sure how I'm going to achieve my own goal right now? How? and then add in those previous two things, isolation and loneliness, and suddenly there's a lot of weight that starts to come in. And it's really hard to figure out what those next steps are supposed to be. Now, we could live there. We could live in the horribleness that was 2020 and 2021 and the COVID virus. And there are a lot of you, I am so sorry that some horrible things did happen and you lost people who were important to you. If I could change it personally, please know that I would. But what I am going to tell you today is we can't go back. There's no welcome back. There's no looking back. There is a welcome forward, though. And a welcome forward is where we take some of the best lessons that we learned during that time. Let's apply them and let's clear up our vision and see what the future can look like for us and start creating that future. So this is where I'm going to ask you to take that paper that I told you at the beginning that we were going to need. I'm going to ask you that you have a piece of paper that is clear on both sides, or you're going to need a couple of pieces of paper. And you're going to have your pen. So I want you to divide one side of that paper into 4 sections. I don't care what your sections look like. You'll notice there's no PowerPoint or Prezi or anything to tell you how to do this, because how you draw on your dry erase board is up to you. How you're going to make your notes is all yours. Nobody can tell me how to draw on mine, so I'm not going to tell you how to draw on yours. But you've got it into 4 sections now. I'm going to be quiet at some different times after I ask some questions over the next few minutes, because I want you to take time. We're going to do this as a group activity. You do not have to share anything that you are going to be writing down. This is yours. I will ask at certain times if anybody wants to share, but please do not feel like you have to. I want this to be valuable to you. So in one of those first sections, I want you to write down 3 words that you would use to describe yourself now. All right. In one of the other sections, write down 3 words or phrases that other people would use to describe you now. Okay, here's a big one. What are 3 words that you want to use to describe yourself, but maybe they don't right now? And here's the last question, and I'm going to allow a little bit longer for the last question because I want you to think for a little bit. What are 2 or 3 things that you have not yet done that you want to do? Now, this is yours to define how you want it to be. It could be related to your health. It could be related to family. It could be something physical. It could be travel. It could be all sorts of stuff. But what I am going to ask you to do is think about this and be specific.
Can you please repeat that again?
Absolutely. Being very specific, what are 2 to 3 things that you have not yet done yet? These can be things that are related to your health, to your family, to your job. They can be specific about travel, anything, but I do want you to be specific in it. So rather than saying get healthy, define what that really means. So we're going to take a few minutes to give you time to do that. Okay, everybody good to keep moving forward? Anybody need any more time? If you need more time, please raise your hand and we'll take another 30 seconds. Okay, no hands raised. All right, of all those words that you wrote at the beginning, the 3 that describe you now, the 3 that other people describe you, the 3 that you want to describe you, look back at those words for a minute. Are there any on there that are opposites? Maybe you wrote that you're sad now and you want to be happy. Identify the opposites for a second. Draw lines between them, circle them, connect them, anything that you need to do there. The second thing I want you to do, is there a word on that list that you just don't like that word? Do you have an emotional response to the negative when you look at that word, or you think about that word, or you hear that word? If I wrote my list a year ago, I would have added unhealthy to that list because during the pandemic, I got into some unhealthy habits with eating. And I have a very negative response to that word now. So do you have a negative response to a word? If you do something to it. Mark it out. Keep it so you can still read it though. Do something. Put a skull and crossbones beside it. Put an X around it. Something for a second. And if it's a word that someone else would use to describe you and you have an emotional response to it, I really do want you to put an X through it. And we're going to get into that reason in just a second. Okay, now we're going to revisit these words for a second. Has there been another word that came to mind in any of those categories that you are now thinking, hey, I wish I'd put that on there instead? Or I really should have thought about that. It's okay. Go ahead and write it on there. This is your sheet of paper. Nobody else gets to see it. It's much like your diary when you were 12 years old and you hid it underneath your cushion or underneath your pillow so nobody else could read it. This is yours. And we're all virtual, so nobody's reading over your shoulder. All right, so you've got a lot of words on your paper, my friends. Now I want you to look down at the section. What are the 2 or 3 things you haven't done yet? And we're going to start doing some relationships between the 2 or 3 things you haven't done yet and all of those words that you've been using to describe yourself or you think others use to describe you. Are there any relationships that you can see yet? You haven't climbed Mount Kilimanjaro yet because, is there a reason or a word that you use to describe yourself? You haven't taken a vacation yet this year because one of the words that you used to describe yourself was overworked. Start looking at the relationships between those words and see if you can start identifying any patterns. When you see a pattern, raise your hand. You do not have to share your pattern. Somebody just hit the hand raise. Oh, I see a hand going up and another hand and another hand. If I were my brother, who's a Baptist pastor, I would have said, I see that hand. How we think about ourselves and how we let other people describe us can affect how we feel, how we act, and how we continue into our future. So now's our opportunity to use the other side of your piece of paper. I want you to take those 2 or 3 things that you haven't done yet and choose one. What is one thing you haven't done yet? And I want you to flip your paper over or start a new piece of paper. And I want you to write that at the top of that paper. Who remembers my last point that I talked about some things that I do not want to go back to from COVID? It was loss of vision. Well, I'm having cataract surgery in the next few months. My doctor just told me last week that that now has to happen. So in the next few months, I'll be having a physical surgery. Sometimes we also have to do an emotional, a mental, whatever surgery to get our lack of vision in those areas back into place also. So now that you've written, what's that one thing you've not done yet? We're going to start building a pathway to get you there. There's some things you might have to overcome. Maybe you've isolated yourself. Maybe you've been scared to move out of your isolation because you've been worried. Maybe you've been lonely. You've not had the right mentors or people or impacts to help you overcome that. Maybe you've just not been able to define what that vision was supposed to be. That's why we're starting with one area right now. So you've got that one area that's written. Now I want you to draw a line and put an arrow at the end of that line. I don't care how you run that line on your paper. I've done this in my visioneering classes before, and people will say, did I draw my line right? My friends, it's your line. Put that arrow on the end because we're going somewhere with this. We're aiming in a direction. So you've got that one area there, the one thing you have not conquered or done yet, but you want to do it. What is the first thing that comes to mind right now that you could start with? It doesn't have to be complicated. I just want the first thing that comes to your mind. You want to run a 5K. The first thing that comes to your mind right now might be, I need a new pair of shoes. The first thing that comes to your mind might be, I don't even run on an everyday basis. Maybe I need to go outside and walk today. What is that first thing that goes at the top of your line, the first of your line, wherever your line is drawn? That is your first thing. One of my favorite quotes is from Henry David Thoreau, and I am going to paraphrase. If you have built your castles in the air, that is where they belong. Now build foundations. My friends, we are starting to build some foundations to that vision that you have so that we're not stuck backward and we are going forward. So that was your first step, whatever that might look like for you. Now draw a tick mark somewhere on that line. Do a separation, whatever it takes. You've got that first step. The next one is not the second step, it's who can help you. One of my favorite books is by an organizational psychologist by the name of Benjamin Hardy. And he wrote this book about 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago, in the middle of the pandemic, and it was Who, Not How. How many times have we all sat down and we thought, well, we need to do this project. How am I going to get that done? The question we often should ask ourselves is, who can help me get that done? So you've got this vision, this thing you have not yet done yet. Who can help you do that? Let's go back to our analogy of running a 5K. Do you have a friend who runs that could give you some pointers? Is there a local group that you could join? Do you need to research online and find a coach online or someone who can help? But who can help you? Now, you don't necessarily have to know the name of that who. You just know that you need someone. And yes, this leads back to those isolation moments we were all having. We lost our who's way back then. So who can help you? Now's the big one. I'm going to ask you to commit to yourself. You are not committing to me. You are not committing to your Toastmasters group. You're not committing to Bert, although I know Bert would love for you to commit to him. But your commitment is, when do you want to have this done? Now, it may not be that you could have every part of it done, but give yourself an end date. Your end date may be, I'm going to contact that coach no later than September 30th, 2022. I'm going to run that 5K no later than June of 2023. I'm going to compete in that next contest that's coming up in my club. I know that your club president would love for you to do that. But when are you going to do that? Now, in the bottom corner of that, I want you to sign your name, and I want you to put today's date. Today's date is August the 11th, 2022. And this, my friends, is a promise to yourself. This is your vision. This is your starting point. Will this get you the whole distance? Maybe not. It might, but it is your starting point. You can take this and add more to it and draw the rest of the timeline out and build out what are the next steps that need to happen to make it happen. What do I have to change inside to start making that happen? Who can help me? When do those steps need to happen? Now I'm going to take this back to me in a moment because I have the podium right now, so I get to talk about myself for a second. I did lose my vision mentally during the great 2020 and 2021. Some other things happened during that time too. My job actually got slammed. We got busy. There were a lot of people who needed marketing help during that time. And I allowed the shifts to happen. I allowed myself to focus in those areas. That's okay. It's time, however, for me to focus back on my vision and what have I done to start making that happen. I did hold virtual visioneering classes during the times when we couldn't meet in person. And I've now actually got a whole curriculum built. So I can do those classes in person or virtually. Rather than being isolated, letting loneliness decide what the next steps were going to be. No. And I had to do the very thing that I walked you all through. What am I feeling about this right now? What words am I using to describe myself? What words do I want to use to describe myself? And then what does that look like for just one thing? There's a lot that we could unpack about everything that happened way back in 9/11 and everything that happened in 2020 and 2021. And we could be here for the rest of the night, but I also know you have a couple of excellent speakers that are coming after me that I can't wait to hear, so I don't want to take up their time. What I do want you to take away, though, is yes, some things do happen that stall us out for a moment, that we need to stop and respect the moment and be in that moment and to value what is happening at that time. But we also need to keep moving forward. There are some great times that are still to come, and there are probably going to be some other times that won't be so great. How we choose to react, how we choose to keep moving forward, and how we choose to not lose our vision will define what happens then as much as it has what's happened over the past few years. Thank you, fellow Toastmasters.